All right. We've got one more outside the SEC before we get into the postseason. We're going to talk about next week. Obviously, there's only one SEC game, so we're going to be more outside the SEC. But we want to touch on this game because it's a big game every year. Even when one team is down or whatever, there's always some interest there. So Ohio State and Michigan. We've talked about Ohio State a couple times this year. We did not expect Florida to beat Michigan, so we were pretty comfortable in that game as well. But finally getting to circle back on this Michigan team that's a little bit battered in terms of not just their personnel, but also sort of the season that they've had relative to expectations. Ohio State, interestingly, even with the second loss, has an outside shot at the playoffs, so they've still got a lot to play for. Obviously, still playing for that Big Ten title. So let's talk a little bit about these two teams. Let's go immediately in what we saw in recent games. So for Michigan, let's talk about Michigan-Wisconsin first. That was a game that was pretty close for a large part of the game. Wisconsin, I think, managed to find some scores that they probably wouldn't have if they had to just drive the length of the field and play it straight up. So let's talk about that game first. I want to tee it up for you. Michigan and Wisconsin, is that a microcosm of Michigan's season and who they are this year, or are they bring something different to the table that they didn't show?
It was a microcosm in a way when you look at the final result, but I thought they showed a different sort of team when Peters was in the ball game. It gave them a little bit of, I won't call it an edge, but it gave them a more dynamic offense than we've seen for a while. O'Korn's pretty limited in a lot of ways. And sometimes you watch guys and it's just immediately apparent when they throw the football. The difference in velocity between Peters and O'Korn just jumps off the screen. That when that happens too, there's a lot of things Michigan can do with Peters and a lot of plays they can run that are just quietly more effective because Peters gets the ball out to a tight end or a running back on a wheel or some easy play, and they have that much longer to get the ball, catch it, and turn and run. Where when O'Korn came in, by the time the ball got there, the receiver's getting laid out because it hung in the air so long. And I think while that's a little bit different, the problem is Peters got hurt, and he got supposedly knocked unconscious. So what we saw from the rest of it was a Michigan front seven that was very good. I think probably still pretty darn underrated, that held tight for most of the game against a team that likes to pound it. But eventually, Michigan in the back seven is just too young, in my view. And there were just several times in that game where they gave up a large end around or a deep pass play, or they'd have a break free for a run. And it only took a few of those plays for things to really turn around. But I think it's interesting that when you look at the win probabilities of that game, in the third quarter with about 4 minutes, 40 seconds left, I don't put a lot of stock in ESPN's win probability. That's a different discussion for a different day. But Michigan was favored to win that game, and it had gone up to about 54%. And then Hornibrook completed that long 51-yard pass play to the Michigan 18. And the moment that hit and Wisconsin scored to make it 14-10, it just plummeted. And it was almost over because not only had that happened, but Michigan hadn't really been able to move the ball consistently. Then Peters went out, and it just tanked. They couldn't move it. And I thought the defense played valiantly, but they got tired. They made some undisciplined errors. And that, to me, has been Michigan for much of the year. It's an offense that can't move the ball well enough to help the defense out. And it's a defense that's so dependent on an very active and disruptive front seven, but can't necessarily deal with it once you get past that first level.
If we're trying to give Michigan a shot in this game, what we try to do for underdogs is take a path down, go down a path where we assume if this team won, if Michigan is able to beat Ohio State, what is that discussion point come Sunday morning? And if we're going to do that here, is it that front seven? Is it a Iowa versus Ohio State type defensive performance that we're going to talk about on Sunday morning if Michigan were able to? I mean, we're not saying it's going to happen, but if that happened, is that the route that they would have to take?
I think so to a large degree. Ohio State's defense has been interesting to me in that they've pretty well shut down the run in most games, but there've been a couple blips. The biggest one was Iowa. They gave up 6.4 yards per carry in that game. And I think quietly, we've talked all year that we felt like their secondary was somewhat vulnerable. And I know we took a lot of heat in the Ohio State Penn State game for that, but they've been, and we'll touch on this a bit more when we circle around and fold Ohio State, but they've benefited from the opponents they've played and the lack of passing games and really been able to focus on the run. For Michigan to be able to win the game in that hypothetical, Michigan's going to have to play a Harbaugh football and really establish the run and move the line of scrimmage. And when the one time a team was able to do that, again, it's the only time all season where a team was able to average 5 yards per carry. They gave up 55 points in a ball game. So there are signs that if you can get to that second level and you can strain Ohio State's defense, that maybe it can break. And so I do think there's a lesson there from the Iowa game because it is such a statistical outlier that sort of indicates what you got to do to win, and that's run the football. Now, that's John Harbaugh football. It's what they like to do, but I still think it's a tall task for their offensive line and their offense in general without balance to be able to do it.
And I know we don't really we're a statistics driven, and we've got a computer model coming later. We're a statistics nerd based channel, so we don't do a lot of the soft skill stuff and the mental stuff. But if we're looking at Ohio State's schedule, 4 road games, 2 were trash teams. Nebraska and Rutgers are trash. I think that's safe to say. So they could have rolled out their third team and won those games. But the other 2 were an opener at Indiana, who's not a bad team. They're not great. They're not elite. They're not a team that's going to scare most top 10 type teams, but they're not a bad team. And then this Iowa game. So is there something there, given the fact that this is at Michigan, that there could be an issue with Ohio State on the road that could come into play here? Or is the Michigan fan base so deflated and Ohio State's got so much to play for that playing on the road is just not going to matter?
I can't see the Michigan fan base just laying down. This is way too big of a rivalry game. We covered the Iron Bowl earlier this year. Everyone understands the Ohio State Michigan game is itself a massive, massive game. The football program is hugely important. The stadium's huge, and I just don't see it, right? I mean, I don't think you can walk into Michigan Stadium and play in the big house with a capacity of 107,000 and not feel it. The problem there is when you talk about the 4 road games that Ohio State's played. Yeah, they struggled against Indiana, but they didn't struggle against Rutgers. They didn't struggle against Nebraska, and Iowa was kind of its own thing at night. I, I don't know how much of it was really road and a home and away. I think it certainly played into it to a certain extent. I think the way Ohio State operates with all the shifts and motions, it's actually a little more important than people might guess because there's a lot of communication and timing involved in that offense, and teams get ramped up and they get disruptive, and it starts to really impact it disproportionately. But I don't know. I don't think it's determinative. I think it's an advantage for Michigan. But I also don't think the Iowa game should be taken as some indication that Ohio State, just because it's loud, is going to necessarily roll over and play dead.
No, and I don't think so either. And that's I think on the road at Iowa is kind of an outlier in regards to road game toughness or getting more out of a home team than you normally would playing above their heads. I think Iowa's kind of special in that regard. That's a tough place to play. Obviously, Penn State struggled there too this year. Let's go ahead and get into numbers and maybe tee up what the computer model says for this game. And go ahead and let me know if you're tracking with that.
Right. So the computer model for this game, first, for those in the Big Ten that haven't heard this before, our model uses per play averages from your opponents. It uses your own per play averages, how you've done relative to each game, and it maps your strength relative to the average strength of your opponent and expected performance. And from there, the first statistic we calculate is a straight up statistic, which is just percentages allowed. So the percentage of opponent averages you allowed. If your opponent's average 6 yards per carry, you allow 4. then you allow 75% of opponent rush averages, for example. From there, we take that, we look at your offensive performance, look at what look at each other's strengths and weaknesses, and defensively and offensively, and project yard per play total, yard per carry, yard per attempt. And then using that, we look at your historical production and we project how many points you're going to score based off of your production in this game. At no point in here do we have variables that we created ourselves. If you're going to ask, well, how do you calculate for weather and home field advantage and lost starters? We intentionally don't do any of that. This is built to be a baseline. And to do that, we only use historical numbers. And the way everything is weighted is based off historical numbers. So everything's unique to each team. It's unique to this matchup. And the whole point is to get as objectively as possible and consistently as possible for every model we run, a baseline for how these teams look compared to each other. In this case, Ohio State's defense is very good against the run, 74%. That's pretty well elite. 74%, really 75% is about where we put the elite line for a run defense. 84% against the pass. 84% against the pass is very good. That is not an elite pass defense. That's just a good to very good pass defense. Really need to be below 80% to be elite. Michigan's run defense, probably a little bit underrated at 79.9%. It says 80% here, and then 82.7% or 83% against the pass. So I think the first thing to note here, Ohio State gets a tremendous amount of credit for the defense. And everybody knows that Michigan's offense is something of an issue, but I don't think they appreciate the fact that Michigan's defense is very good. Ohio State has 74% of opponent rush averages. Michigan is 80. Ohio State has 84% of opponent pass averages. Michigan only allows 83%. Michigan's passing defense has been better than Ohio State's relative to competition. So I think the first sort of caveat here is if you were to leave it on defenses alone, Ohio State only has a slight edge. The problem is, unsurprising to anyone, the offenses are kind of in a different class. Ohio State's averaging 6 yards per carry, 8.5 per attempt. Michigan, it's pretty much a full standard deviation lower, 4.6 yards per carry, 6.8 yards per attempt. Because of that, you end up in a situation where Ohio State should still be able to average almost 5 yards per carry. And Michigan shouldn't be able to average 3.5 yards per carry or 5.7 yards per attempt, just based off trends for both teams. That comes out to almost 6 yards per play for Ohio State, only 4.3 yards per play by Michigan. And if you use that and plot it against data points, and we do it, it's not linear. We actually plot it against a curve. Point being, some teams, if you get 4 yards per play, you can't do anything. But if you get 5.5, you can score 30 points. It varies team to team, but it tends not to be a linear progression. Then you end up, it's projecting Ohio State to have 31 points and Michigan 17. I think probably too, if that sounds a little crazy or if you don't have faith in our model, one thing I'll go back and note is we did the Ohio State-Penn State game, and we predicted in that game, as I said, plotting production, we actually predicted that Ohio State would outgain Penn State, but still manage to lose by 2. And in that game, Ohio State outgained Penn State significantly, and then Ohio State won by 1. So the model in the past when we did that game may have had the wrong winner, but we were still beating the spread. We were only 3 points off of the margin. And more importantly, it noted the fact that Penn State was going to be a lot more productive from their yardage than Ohio State was. In this case, it's actually kind of a little bit different. Ohio State just does a better job of scoring with their yardage than Michigan. So even though the yardage differential is significant, the point differential is almost double.
Yeah, I thought it was funny that Ohio State fans came back and they're like, how about your model now? And I'm like, dude, our model was 3 points off and there were gobs of points scored. I was really, really excited about that. And kind of a funny anecdote there. If Penn State, when they got that ball in that short field, managed to kick a field goal at the end of that game, our model would have predicted the exact score. So it's been a pretty good year for the model. It got beat up a little bit last week with Auburn, 2 weeks ago with Auburn and Georgia. I think the score is going to be a little worse. And the reason being, I do think that Michigan's got a fantastic defense. I think they've got such problems at quarterback and just offensive production in general, that, like we said with Clemson in South Carolina, I think a lot of short fields and a lot of 3 and out is going to greatly put that defense in a bad spot. And we've even seen, like with Alabama, with elite defenses, when you can't convert a third down and you're going 3 and out 2, 3, 4 times in a row, it doesn't matter how good your defense is. It doesn't matter how deep your defense is. By the late third, fourth quarter, they're going to give up points. So I'm going to go 37-13 for my gut pick. Let me know what you think about that and what you think your pick is going to be.
I understand your point, and I think it's quite valid. I think, assuming, and I haven't really heard if Peters is going to play or not. I assume since he was knocked unconscious, he'll be concussion protocol and won't be playing. I think everything's been radio silent to this point from Harbaugh. We record first thing in the week. I'm concerned with O'Korn in the game because O'Korn may be an experienced guy and he may have played really well in the past and he may have came in and led them to a victory, but when he starts throwing the football, he's really limited. He's just really limited. And that's not a good thing against this Ohio State offense. Now, I do think that Michigan's defense is frankly underrated. They're really good, and Michigan may not be having, an earth-shattering season, but there's nothing to be ashamed of at this point. They're a 3-loss team going into the Ohio State game. They've been able to stay in games even when they can't blow out teams because the offense isn't super productive. And they're going to be up for this one. So I don't think there's going to be any quit from the Michigan side of the field. I also think we've seen from Ohio State, we've talked about this quite a bit in the past, their offense is disproportionately affected by your ability to slow them down. And, right now we're predicting them to have somewhere around 5.8 yards per play, right? And that prediction at 31 points, maybe is a little bit aggressive. This is predicting them to have less yard per play average than they had against Iowa. They only scored 24 points in that game. I don't buy, and I should note when they had 5.1 yards per play against Oklahoma, they only scored 16. This yardage projection is closer to those Iowa games and the Oklahoma games than they are really anything else on the schedule. Given that, I think this is going to be lower scoring. My concern is whether Michigan can keep up. So I think probably something like 23. I'm going to go with 23-10 as my projection. I don't think Michigan's going to win this game because I just don't think they can score. And I think Ohio State is going to find a way to win. If I were to map it to another game, I think it's going to resemble a little bit Indiana. What I've seen from Michigan as a football team is you've got some guys that are young and learning because they had so much turnover on the defensive side of the football that they're not necessarily solid everywhere. Devin Bush and David Long, Josh Metellus may be great athletes, but they're not always where they need to be doing what they need to be doing. And I think at times their defensive front dominates, but what we saw in the Wisconsin game is they gave up some big plays once guys got to the second level. And I point to the Indiana-Ohio State game because Indiana really stymied Ohio State in the front and didn't really let Ohio State do what they wanted to do in terms of their horizontal offense and going side to side and creating opportunities in space. But what ended up happening later is Ohio State realized if they started running a lot of deep crossing routes and doing some things down the field and got guys isolated, their athleticism let them generate some really big plays, and they blew that game open. I don't think Michigan is Indiana, and they're not going to let it be so easy. But I think Ohio State's going to get a couple big chunk plays once they get to the second level, much the same way Wisconsin did. And that's how I end up getting with my coming.
And I can see it. I mean, we've talked all year about Michigan's defense, and we were obviously, even though Florida's offense is an absolute dumpster fire, we were impressed with what we saw with them, especially considering how much they were replacing from last year. And everybody's down on Harbaugh, or Michigan fans are, because he's not getting these signature wins against top tier, rivals. But to realize what he was replacing from last year's defense, we likened it to being worse than Tennessee in the SEC. So bringing it close to home. And Tennessee lost a lot of key players, not as many players on their defense, and they're atrocious this year. So the job they've done to replace that much talent and that much production in this year, I think if you had ceiling high expectations for them, given what they had to replace, it was really unreasonable. And the one that we're tracking with the SEC, that guy's already lost his job, and he's losing to teams like Missouri by 50 points. So I think the effort that they've given and the job that he's done this year is completely underrated, and I think some of the criticism is completely unfair. Anything else on this game before we wrap this one up?
I don't think so, really. I do think it's going to be a tough game, and maybe tougher than some think. And it'll be interesting to see back to back how Michigan does against Ohio State versus how well Michigan did against Wisconsin. It's kind of a fun little snapshot going in, to this upcoming Big Ten title game, that if Ohio State beats Michigan, we can kind of look back and have a direct data point, and that's going to get hyper analyzed. But the one thing I'll caution with Ohio State, and we've said this all year, like everybody in college football this year, there's only been a handful of games that really matter. And Ohio State is getting beaten up and torn down based off, for example, the Oklahoma game or the Penn State game or the Michigan State game. Well, they throttle Michigan State. They lose badly to Oklahoma. It's going to be important not to take too much from the Wisconsin game, because games turn out differently and the same team can play differently day in and day out. And regardless of how it turns out, I think, it could be a huge blowout. It could be a really close game. I'm not sure that's going to necessarily tell people how the Ohio State-Wisconsin game is going to go a week later.
But I think it's a worthy follow-up to that, and I'll ask you this. If you're Ohio State right now, you're on the outside looking in for the college football playoff, you probably assume some things are going to happen to at least get you close. Even with the blowout loss to Iowa, there's going to be an argument to be made at the end of the year if you can manage to beat Wisconsin. How much of that is in your mind and in your strategy against Michigan in terms of style points, making a statement, letting people know that you're still around? Is that something we're going to see Saturday, or is it just win, baby, and we'll figure out the rest later?
I think it is, frankly, having looked at the way Urban Meyer handles these situations in the past. The big example was the Wisconsin Big Ten championship game in 2014, where they came out. They didn't just demolish them, they demolished them and kept scoring because they knew style points mattered. And I also think Urban Meyer feels like he needs to establish rhythm. He's drilled 2 teams in a row. He saw his team be flat against Iowa, and he wants them to get used to playing up to a high level. The issue with that, I will say, is it's a little bit dangerous. If you start putting that much pressure on yourself to be successful, when you go into a game against a team like Michigan, maybe they come out firing and maybe they get up. And if they get up fast on Michigan, this game's probably going to turn into a blowout. But the more likely result is they're going to struggle a little bit early, because Michigan has some really darn disruptive players in the front 7, and Ohio State's offense, it's difficult to play against that kind of front. Do you get disheartened? Because if you've pumped yourself up into trying to score 60, 70 points, you can get really out of sorts when it doesn't happen, and you can get impatient. And those are the times when teams sort of struggle and fall out of place, and that's how you end up with the results like they saw against the Iowa game. So while I think you may be right that they play for style points, I will also say it's really dangerous to do that and to push your football team to do it, because you need to play each play as its own, and you need to be focusing on what to do right now. And if you're looking at results and you're not focusing about what you need to accomplish at this moment, you're just setting yourself up for failure.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, and we've seen that happen a little bit in the past with some SEC teams that were on the outside looking in and ended up losing the game. I don't think that's going to happen here. And I frankly think that Michigan, Ohio State needs to go pretty big for Ohio State just to stay. They're in the conversation. Even with 2 losses, they're in the conversation, but they've only got so many opportunities left for them to put a stamp. Like, yes, there's going to be some external things that got to happen to get them in, but they also have to do their part. And I think they're going to try to do their part this Saturday. Based on my score prediction, I think they're going to be able to do that in a large part. But like you said, That can also backfire, especially from the frustration standpoint, especially when you think you're playing an inferior opponent, but they're good on defense. That's when you give them an in. So, y'all, that's it for our previews this week. We did 4. The Iron Bowl was really long. Ohio State fans, I know you hate listening to SEC chatter, but if you're going to be in the playoffs, you probably want to familiarize yourself with some SEC opponents. So maybe check out the Iron Bowl game that we talked about. But if you're still with us, Ohio State and Michigan fans, comment in the comments. Let us know what your score prediction is, and maybe start that chatter about the Wisconsin Ohio State matchup next week. But don't overlook your opponent. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.